So continue with the theme of leisure activities, and there's four statements here from four Talmidei Chachamim, and the first one is says, remember the Sabbath day. Is it possible to forget it? It's not every seventh. Is not every seventh day the Sabbath? Yet remembering means avoidance of things which make one forgetful of the meaning of the day. Perform that which reminds you of the Shabbos. Wash on Friday, change your clothes, prepare for a day of festivity, and read material appropriate to Shabbos. And that is from Rabbeinu Yehuda HaChassid. Next one comes from Gaon Rav Yeshaya Horovitz. Remember this, the Sabbath day means do not greet with the usual good morning, but greet with reference to the Shabbos. And the Rambam says, remember the Sabbath day means other peoples of the world have a name for each weekday. In Hebrew, these days have no names. Each day is known as a number in order to count up to the Shabbos. Like today is Yom Sheni. There's no Monday, Tuesday. It's Yom Sheni today. And as you say in the prayer of the day, the blessing of the day at the end of Shacharit, that's because you count up to Shabbos. And the last one is from Rav Moshe Rice. Remember the Shabbos day means the generations of the 20th century have made most astonishing achievements in science and technology, almost feeling as though they are in control of the world. This is why we need the reminder of the Shabbos even more than the early generations to recognize our limited scope in the universe. Okay, let's, so that's it. So you've got to be conscious of it. And I don't know about you guys, but sometimes you feel the Shabbos, you feel it's a different day. I don't know if you guys have that feeling.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I do.
Yeah, I do. I think what makes Shabbat special is the fact that one has to put special preparation into it. It's just like your Olam Haba. The quality of your Olam Haba has to do with the fact that you're cognizant of the holiness of the day and the fact that your preparation is done well, that you're not skidding into Shabbos. And I think the most difficult thing when you first start to keep Shabbos, not if you're an employee, but if you have your own business and a lot of stresses, is to keep off thoughts of the mundane out of your head. And that to a large degree is a kindness from Hashem, because if you have financial worry or drama with a client, that's out of your control. So I think it's a lot of Hashem's chesed, a great deal that is helped. I can tell you in particular that I don't have that sort of drama. Yeah.
The thing I like about Harry Potter, what's the best day about Sunday? There's no post on Sundays. What's the best part about Shabbat? There's no calls on Shabbos.
Yeah, I think that makes a big deal, Arth, that there's no calls from me or Clifford or anybody else. But I'm saying on a serious note.
Yeah, I am. That gives you that break.
Yeah, everybody does need a break. All right, so we're going to get started with the shiur. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to familiarize you guys with the Mishnah, quickly read it, and then go on to the Gemara. All right, so the Mishnah. In the 54th daf, the previous Mishnayos discusses the law of bor within the context of an ox or a donkey. Just hang on a sec, guys. Falling into it. It chooses these examples in keeping with the verse in Exodus chapter 21, verse 33. If a man shall uncover a pit and an ox or donkey shall fall into it. The following Mishnah teaches that this law, as well as several other laws, are not restricted to these two species, but apply to all animals and fowl. The same law that applies to an ox also applies to any domestic animal in regard to payment of damages for falling into a pit, in regard to the forced separation from Mount Sinai at the giving of the Torah, and in regard to the twofold payment a thief must make for stealing an animal, and in regard to returning a lost object, and in regard to unloading an animal. and in regard to the prohibition of muzzling an animal when it's threshing, and in regard to the prohibitions of kilayim, in other words, mating or plying with diverse species together, and in regard to the prohibition against having one's animals work on the Sabbath. In every one of these 8 cases, the same rules that apply to an ox or a donkey apply to all domestic animals. Moreover, any wild beast or bird is legally the same as the domestic animals in regard to these 8 issues. Okay? If so, why is specifically an ox or donkey mentioned in connection with falling into a pit, and why are there similar specifications in other cases? It is not because the laws are restricted to these species. Rather, it is because Scripture speaks of the usual case. Okay, now that we've just got our head back in the Gemara since Saturday night, I'm going to start off with the actual Gemara itself. So the Gemara basically listed 8 laws that the Torah stated in connection with specific animals that actually apply to all creatures. The Gemara proceeds to expound the sources for this broader application, beginning with the first law, in regard to falling into a pit. Although the Torah initially mentions an ox or donkey, it's written in the very next verse, the owner of the pit shall make restitution, he shall return the money to its owner. Okay? And where was that from? Shmot chapter 21, verse 34. And as stated above, we know this comes to include any creature that has an owner. And in fact, you would think that even an inanimate object or anything that is owned should be included. In fact, it even goes so far as to ask maybe one's slaves, who is your property, are they included that if they're damaged, you have to pay the owner of that person back for the damages to even people in that case. And we learned no. When it mentions ox, it mentions ox but not people, donkey but not utensils. How it extrapolates that, guys, I said to you the other day, in earnest, I have no idea. I don't know how it derives the one from the exclusion of the other. Rabbi Cohen would be able to tell you that's above my pay grade, but as long as you know, that's what the Gemara says. So this we've learned before. So what's this new part? This is the new part. In regard to the second law, the forced separation from Mount Sinai, the Torah states that whoever touches the mountain, whether behemoth or person, he shall not live. Okay? That's in Exodus chapter 19, verse 13. And in that category, it says, and a wild beast is included in the scriptural category behemoth. Okay? Because the word behemoth can be used in a specific or general sense. In the specific sense, it refers only to domesticated species, cows, sheep, goats, etc. But in the general sense, behemoth can refer to all animals, including non-domestic species, which is a chayos, such as lions, deer. So the basis for the broad interpretation, guys, do you remember where it is? We went through it.
Shmot, isn't it? Shmot or Devarim.
Well, exactly. Devarim chapter 14, verse 4. Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 4. Excellent, Kevin. So this is the behemoth that you may eat. And then it proceeds to enumerate several domestic animals and wild beasts. Okay? Because even wild beasts, if they fit within the category of chewing its cud and having split hooves, it is kosher. They have to be shechted in the right way. So even a chaya can be included under the general heading of behemoth. That's brought by Rashi in Chulin, the 71st daf. Okay? So at the moment, actually, they're learning Chulin at Yeshiva Gedola, all the students. It's quite a hard one that I haven't gone through it. I started doing a bit of it with Tal Dinner years ago, and I must tell you something. It's quite dry, the subject matter, and very detailed. So at least Bava Kamma's got a bit of variety, although it's all Torah, it's all good. So
a lot of meat to it, Damon.
There's a lot of meat to it, exactly, Kevin. And the thing of it is, who was I learning it with? Tal Dinner, who's a vegetarian. He gave me tofu. He gave me tofu, and he was learning the laws of meat. I said to him, is this supplied by Dunlop, the tire company? I don't know tofu. Wasn't fun. It's expensive though. It costs more than salmon toast. Anyway.
Is that what he gave you? Is that what he gave you for dinner?
No, he's a strict vegetarian. They make stunning food. No, I tell you something. They make stunning food, but tofu's an acquired taste. Okay,
no, that was a joke. I said that's what he gave you for dinner.
Dinner. Oh yeah, told dinner. So just hang on. There is an extra thing that in the words of the verse, Kev, it says im lerabot et ha-ofot, which means the word weather. So it comes to include birds. I suppose because it even flows in good weather. Hey, Kevin, I thought you'd appreciate that. So that's in the 62nd daf of Bava Kamma. Now, so anyway, apart from Behema that we know, what's the whole category of chayos in Behema is that their carcass conveys tumah through touching or carrying. So that's why it has to have the word weather to include birds. So whether it's wild, whether it's domesticated, etc., that includes birds. So now we're learning the source for the Mishnah's third law. Okay, in regard to the twofold payment of a thief that we've stated elsewhere, that's in the 62nd daf. The Torah states explicitly that the twofold payment applies to an ox, donkey, sheep, and garment, and adds for any matter of liability. Guys, what do you think we mean by any matter of liability? Guys,
even what's called non-living things, inanimate objects.
Well, anything you steal, basically. And that's in Shmot chapter 22, verse 8. It's mentioning the big things that generally people take. It's easiest to take things with legs, by the way, or things that are not that heavy like garments. But it could be a laptop or anything that you're liable for, okay, for any matter of liability. So this phrase is basically it's basically a klal, and then it becomes a prat, and then it becomes a klal, because then it's talking about an ox, donkey, sheep, and garment, and says for any matter of liability. Okay, so then what you have is a generalization, a specialization, and a generalization. So if a thief steals any animal or bird or even an inanimate object, he is liable to the twofold payment. Now, you guys are probably going to ask me, well, where do we get the fourth and fifth fold payment from? We're going to hit that in the 62nd and 63rd daf. Okay? But the word klal here, this is to remember, is not a generalization term. It's an inclusionary term. What's the difference, guys, between an inclusionary term and a generalization? I can give you a quick definition. So a generalization is when you turn around, Gavin, and said, shall fall, to talk about in the pit, in the word, in the verb. It means anything that falls in, okay? So that is, you're starting off with a generalization. You can't include things if they haven't been mentioned yet. Only once you've got your list can you then have an inclusion clause. You can have a generalization including everything and then mention specific things, or you can have a specific things and then have an inclusion clause to add other things. Does that make sense? It depends where it is in the sentence. So klal can also be an inclusionary term. Why? Because we mentioned specific animals in the garment, and then we said basically for any matter of liability. So the phrase is a generalization and is expounded to include anything for which there could be liability. So if a thief steals an animal or a bird or even an inanimate object, he's liable to the twofold payment. So now we're going to learn the fourth rule. In regard to returning a lost object, after specifying certain animals that one must return, the Torah adds, what does it add? So shall you do for any lost article of your brother. And where was that? That was, we studied it the other day in Deuteronomy, Devarim, chapter 22, verse 3. And then, in a nutshell, I just want to go at a quick pace. So what does it mean, lost articles? It includes birds, even inanimate objects, everything. Now the source for the Mishnah's fifth law. So in regard to unloading a struggling animal, okay, so the Torah speaks only of a donkey. Why, Kevin, would it speak of a chamor initially?
Because that's a working animal.
Correct. That's the animal you load stuff onto, or you ride yourself, etc. So it's derived through a gezerah shav of the word donkey from the passage dealing with Shabbat, that the commandment applies regarding all living creatures. So what's that law in Shabbat? You're not allowed to get your ox to work, your donkey to work, your manservants, your maidservants. You're not allowed to work. So we extrapolated from the gezerah shava there. How do you know it's a gezerah shava in both sides of the term donkey to include other animals? Because if you remove the word donkey and other animals are included, you're not losing any context of the sentence. If I said to you a donkey and all other animals, okay, or behemoths or whatever, and I left out the word donkey, would you need me to mention the word donkey, yes or no? No. So therefore, it's an open gezerah shava. So it's interchangeable with the donkey for the passage of Shabbat, the same as for returning a lost object. And that's how we know to include other animals from that same sort of general inclusionary law, okay? Okay, so where's this? In Shemot chapter 23, verse 5. That's the law for unloading a donkey. In Exodus chapter 23, verse 5, and in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 14, is the law regarding the donkey and Shabbat. Why? It says, but the seventh day is Shabbat to Hashem your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son, your daughter, your slave, your maidservant, your ox, your donkey, your every behemoth, etc. Right? So since you should derive below that the Sabbath prohibition applies to all living creatures, we may deduce through the gezerah shava that the commandment to help unload a struggling animal also applies to all creatures. That's what Rashi says. Okay. So now we're learning the Mishnah's sixth law. And by the way, from the gezerah shava, guys, you wouldn't even need that to say you need to help your fellow man. I mean, you could get that from the gezerah shava itself, I guess. But why? Because it's obvious if you help an animal, would you not help your fellow man? Obviously. You don't even need it. It's pure logic. So the sixth law, in regard to the prohibition of muzzling an animal when it is threshing, again, Kevin, what's threshing?
When you separate the wheat from the chaff.
Excellent. Excellent. It's a bashing process. Or you've got drums that go like this, and they separate the wheat from the chaff. One of the ways it does it is certain parts like the kernels of corn or the kernels of grain or the wheat kernels, etc., are heavier than the chaff. So gravity and banging seems to separate it. An ox that stand on it separated. What joke are you going to make now?
The wheat kernels are the highest rank out of all of those.
The highest?
The kernels are the highest rank out of all of that stuff.
Cute. That's actually kind of cute. Kevin, that's kind of cute. So
Sorry, I didn't lose your track of thought. Yeah.
Do you want to say that Colonel Sanders has to use corn then for part of his battering process? Yes. Does he batter the corn, or does he use corn in his batter, Kev?
He has to feed the chickens with it. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you get my pun?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Batter, exactly.
Okay.
James.
Yeah.
I hope you can delete this part. But does he batter his corn? You said.
I'll have to stop it, man.
Thanks, Arthur. I actually have to now edit it exactly in this part. Thanks
exactly,
for
as I said.
Arthur.
Pause and re-record. Are you talking about battering corn? I just want to know the fact.
Arthur, you're the one. You're the king. You shouldn't be talking like that. You're very from.
Anything. I'm talking about the corn.
Okay, so in regard to the prohibition of muzzling an animal, we shall muzzle Arthur when he's threshing the corn. Exactly. Okay, right. Now, although the Torah mentions only an ox, why? Because it said Yaliv Shor, it's derived through the gezerah shava of an ox. Okay, so when you're talking about muzzling an ox, you also take the word ox from the passage dealing with Shabbat. and that restriction applies to all living creatures. Okay, so the ox that's specified in regard to threshing, Deuteronomy Devarim chapter 25 verse 4, as well as in regard to Shabbat. Okay, right, so now we've got the Gezerah Shava there. So the word, the passage in Shabbat, Gavin, is being used as a Gezerah Shava to apply those laws of inclusivity for other animals backwards and forwards. And so too, that verse in the other four verses is doing it for Shabbat. So there's the seventh law in regard to the prohibition of kilayim. Arthur, kilayim is basically it's the grafting of different species or the breeding of different species, which is prohibited. So if you need the source for kilayim prohibition of playing with different species, where the Torah only mentions the combination of an ox or a donkey. Now, where's this? This is in Deuteronomy, Devarim, chapter 22, verse 10. You shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. Okay? Then it's derived through the Gezerah Shava of ox and ox from the passage dealing with Shabbat, that the prohibition applies to all other species as well. And if you need the source for kilayim, prohibiting of mating of two different species, not just having them work together, it's derived through the Gezerah Shava. Well, it actually applies to all the other behemoths, and it's derived through the Gezerah Shava of behemoth from the passage dealing with the Sabbath, that the restriction applies to all living creatures. In terms of kilayim, we learned with the Deuteronomy about not plying two animals together, but in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 19, you shall not mate your behemoth into another species. So that's talking about mating, okay? And then the restriction applies to all living creatures. In fact, when we learned Sanhedrin with Schottenstein, it's got in that verse, it discusses that you're not allowed to have fish and fowl working together. So I said to Rav Simcha at the time, I don't think he really appreciated it. I said, what are you going to exactly do? Have your chicken by the ocean with your fishing rod? I said, how's that going to work? Maybe I shouldn't share everything I say aloud. Anyway,
Yeah, it's a good principle. So I've also implemented that principle, and it's helped me a lot.
okay.
I don't always think about it. I sometimes don't follow it, but I'm supposed to. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I'm going through this very fast, guys, because it's not, I just wanted to go cover ground. So the Gemara turns to the eighth and final law mentioned in our Mishnah, the prohibition against having one's animal work on the Sabbath. The presumption that this law pertains to any living creature served as the basis for all the Gezerah Shavas mentioned above. And what in regard to the Sabbath restriction itself, from where do we know that it applies to all living creatures? The Torah mentions only your ox, your donkey, and your every behemoth, okay? So there, the word behemoth, we know you can include even wild species of animals. But where do we get the mentioning of birds, guys? Okay, because there's two different versions. I think let me go back a step. Rav Yossi said in the name of Rav Yishmael, in the first version of the Ten Commandments, it stated, you shall not do any work, you, your son, your daughter, your slave, your maid servant, your behemoth, etc. Right? But there's a latter version of the Ten Commandments, and there it's stated, you shall not do any work, you, your ox, your donkey, your every behemoth. Now the ox and the donkey were already mentioned in the general term every behemoth. It's stated in the same verse. So then why were they singled out? They were singled out to tell you the following. Just as it's true that the ox and the donkey mentioned here, that any wild beast or bird has the same status. And if so too, it's true of any law mentioning an ox or a donkey, that any wild bird or beast has the same status regarding the law. Okay? Let me just go through something. So Rashi brings that the term and your every behemoth and your every is an inclusionary term. Guys, if I say to you, put everything on the boat before we leave on vacation, in your boot of your car, what do you think I'll mean? Everything. So Rashi said the term everything or every is denoting all kinds of creatures. It's an inclusionary term. Okay, so that includes birds or winged creatures, so to speak. Okay, so also when you find it in every other section where it mentions ox or donkey, you can know that the behemoth of every category includes birds, wild beast or bird, and they have the same status. So the Gemara objects, noting what? That the Sabbath verses don't necessarily need to be understood as including all the creatures. Why? Let's say that the correct method of expounding the verses is as follows. Your term, your behemoth, right? In the first version of the Ten Commandments, it's a generalization. And then you've got the words your ox or your donkey in the latter version of the commandments. Now, that's not mentioned in the first part. That's a specification, right? And then the generalization contains nothing more than the specification. So what is the problem with that? When you've got a generalization and then you go to specify and tunnel in, you're now only talking about the specialization. That's the problem that the Gemara is bringing up. So we ought to say that an ox or a donkey, yes, they're the subject to the Sabbath restriction, but any other animal is not subject to this restriction. So the Gemara answers, they say that when the Torah continues with your phrase, your every behemoth in the latter version of the commandments, again, then it generalizes. Why? Because the rule is that whenever the Torah states a generalization, then there's a specification, and then you can find another generalization with the word every other creature, because then it comes to generalize or include other creatures. You may expound the overall law to include only those things that are similar to the specification. Okay, so then you've got a slight problem without the word every. So therefore the derivation teaches, just as the specified items, which is what? Ox and donkey, are specifically living creatures, so too all living creatures are subject to the Sabbath restriction. This includes domestic animals, wild beasts, and birds. So the Gemara questions the assumption that is similar to the specification, and the rule teaches us to include every living creature. Okay, so let me just cover a bit more, but let's say as follows. Okay, so just as the specified item is talking about something quite specific, because so far the things we mentioned are only carcasses that transmit tumah through contact and carrying. And then the derivation teaches us to include anything else as carcasses transmit tumah through what? Contact and carrying. So only animals will be included in the Sabbath restriction, but birds will not be included. That's what the Gemara is asking. Because again, when you go from a generalization to a specialization to a generalization, or expand it, constrain it and expand it, when you expand it, it doesn't go back to initial generalization. It's expanded one level up within certain parameters. So again, that argument reasserts itself that we had with Bor. Is it talk about all living creatures or only creatures that convey tumah through its carcass, which is kosher and non-kosher animals, but mammals mainly, not winged animals, not birds, that's for sure. So the Gemara answers, look, they say that if this is so, the Torah meant to include only those living creatures that are similar to an ox and the donkey in every respected tumah transmission. Okay? So what it's saying there is, look, it mentioned an ox or donkey. So all you need is to mention one particular creature, because if I mention one creature, then it's going to be focused on every aspect of that creature. The minute I mention another creature, you're expanding the definition boundary. So what happens if I just mentioned ox? Remember we learned this in the last stuff, guys. Kevin, what did we say? Gavin?
What about ox?
So I said, so the Gemara says, let the merciful one in his Torah write only one thing. It's a specification, right? Either ox or donkey. And that would have sufficed. By specifying an additional item, the merciful one indicates that the generalization, specification, generalization includes anything that is similar to the specified item, even in one respect. In other words, in being a living creature, thus even birds are included. Okay? So the explanation is rejected. Why? Because you can't mention one thing. Why? Because if you only wrote an ox or a donkey, let's carry this forward, like we discussed before. So in other words, if you're mentioning an ox or a donkey, it meant that it could be, it would be specific. And the minute you mention ox and donkey, it comes to include birds, because it only has to be similar in one regard as a living creature. Whereas if you mentioned only ox or donkey, it has to be specific exactly in that category because there's no variant. So remember, we learned which of these items would you have the merciful one wrote. If you wanted to include only living creatures whose carcass conveyed tumah through contact or being carried, in other words, does an ox or donkey convey tumah through carrying or touching? Yes or no? Both of them.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, if we mentioned only ox, what's the problem, Kevin? We learned this in the last stuff. Gavin?
Only ox.
Yeah, what's the problem with that? What could we have come to the conclusion to realize?
Only kosher animal.
Well, I think that's a fair assumption, Gavin.
It can't be, only ox can be sacrificed, not a donkey.
Exactly. So Kevin did it dead on the mark. What's the implication of...
Gavin also, we are team effort.
The offering on the donkey, you just can't offer the donkey itself, but you still have to do the before on the donkey. That's why.
Yeah, I know, but it's a separate issue. So Gavin's right in that the reason we can offer it on an altar generally is because it's a kosher animal. So Kevin is right in terms of how to apply the law. Gavin's right in regard to the restrictive nature of the law. So in other words, an ox, because you can put it on the altar. But the problem is if you mention that, then any animal that's not kosher, like a donkey, or that couldn't go on the altar, would be excluded, including a donkey, by the way. You can't bring a donkey on the altar. But what Gavin brought as the perfect point is that a bechor, which is redeemed, the firstborn creature that is redeemed, applies also to a person, even though it's not kosher, which means we would have then come to the conclusion that an ox would be okay because an ox also has a firstborn that could be redeemed, but then we would have limited it and not included any other non-kosher animals that are workhorses that got damaged in your pit for liability. Exactly as you're saying. So let me just read it out a sec. You guys are perfect. So which of these items, ox or donkey, would you have the merciful one right? If he wanted to include only living creatures whose carcasses conveyed tumah through contact and through being carried, if the merciful one had written only an ox, I would have said that the animal that can be offered on the altar like an ox, it's included. But an animal that cannot be offered on the altar is not included. So to do away with the supposition, the merciful one wrote a donkey, which is never offered upon the altar. And if the merciful one had written only a donkey, I would have said that an animal that is subject to the consecration of its firstborn like a donkey is included, but an animal that is not subject to the consecration of its firstborn is not included. Accordingly, the merciful one wrote an ox, which is superfluous, to teach us that even animals not subject to consecration of their firstborn are included. Once we have excluded those standards, we must determine the common denominator of an ox or donkey. The most precise common denominator is that there are living creatures whose carcass transmits tumah through contact and carrying. Only items that are similar to the specification in this respect are included, but birds are excluded. So the question remains, where do we get birds inclusion from? And the Gemara concedes that the word every behema is an inclusionary term, and we would need to learn it from there. Okay? So you can't expound it with the generalization, specification, generalization, but rather with the inclusionary term every behema. Okay?